The gavel had barely left the wood when it happened. A sound no federal courtroom is designed for. A sound that broke through the stiff walls of procedure and echoed like thunder through history. Applause. Not the polite tapping of palms against palms, but an eruption, raw and uncontainable. Gasps gave way to shouts, hands rose, and the air itself seemed to tremble. It was as though the room had forgotten its duty to silence, swept up in something bigger, something undeniable. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, composed, unflinching, with the fire of truth still lingering in her words. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Precision, clarity, dignity. Each sentence she delivered cut through arrogance like glass through smoke. For one suspended moment, every eye was fixed on her, and every heart was forced to admit what the mind could no longer deny. Brilliance had just been displayed in its purest form. Then came the moment that turned astonishment into legend. Judge Amul Thapar, a man not known for lavish gestures, leaned forward. His words rang out clear, a rare acknowledgment in the stoic language of the bench. He honored her craft. He praised her sharpness. He validated her not just as an attorney, but as a force of intellect that could not be ignored. The courtroom didn't just hear his words, they felt them. And in that instant, applause was no longer a breach of decorum. It was history asserting itself. Reporters scribbled furiously. Witnesses exchanged looks of disbelief, and even those who came prepared to oppose her found themselves caught in a wave too strong to resist. The applause carried weight, the kind of weight that signals a cultural shift, the kind that whispers, "Something bigger just happened here." But applause is only the visible surface of a deeper story. What led to this eruption? How did a lone voice, sharpened by resilience, come to dismantle arrogance so cleanly that even the walls of tradition cracked open to let in thunderous recognition? The answer lies not in the applause itself, but in the journey that brought us here. A journey of arrogance colliding with dignity, of one underdog rising against the odds. And as we rewind the reel of this courtroom drama, one truth becomes clear. The story begins with a confrontation nobody expected.
To understand the explosion of applause, we must step back into the shadowed air of uncertainty that hung over the case itself. This wasn't just another docket number, another hearing tucked away in the endless machinery of American law. No, this was a battlefront. At its core, the case pressed on the very nerves of civil rights and accountability. Two words that carry centuries of blood, sacrifice, and promise. Behind the legal jargon was a question that pierced deeper than statutes. Who gets to define justice in America? The courtroom was packed for a reason. The opposition had walked in confident, draped in arrogance as though it were armor. They believed the law bent easily under the weight of power. They had wielded it before, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with brutal effectiveness, and expected to wield it again. For them, this case was supposed to be routine, a stage to reassert dominance, to remind those who dared to challenge the hierarchy that truth is often silenced by authority. But this was not routine for the people watching, for families whose lives hinged on fair representation, for citizens who had seen too many loopholes protect the powerful. This moment was charged with possibility. Jasmine Crockett's presence shifted the air. She didn't come as a spectacle. She came as a mirror. Her arguments would reflect not only the flaws in the opposition's logic, but also the moral corruption that had seeped into the very corners of governance. Outside the courthouse, America itself was in turmoil. Political divides cut deeper than ever, each headline screaming louder than the last. Truth felt fragile, like glass dangling over concrete, one crack away from shattering. Justice felt elusive, like a shadow chased but never caught. And yet, dignity, the quiet strength of people unwilling to surrender their humanity, persisted. In that climate, the stakes of this case transcended law books. They became symbolic of something much larger, whether arrogance could still bully truth into silence. The tension was palpable. Journalists whispered about how this case could set precedent. Activists marched with signs demanding accountability, and ordinary citizens tuned in because they recognized the drama unfolding was more than politics. It was identity. It was belonging. It was the eternal struggle between those who seek to dominate and those who refuse to be erased. And then came the misstep. One slip of arrogance from the opposition, a dismissive remark meant to belittle, meant to undercut. They thought it clever. They thought it final. Instead, it became the loose thread that would unravel their entire argument. In that instant, the narrative shifted. The arrogance they wore as armor revealed itself as brittle glass. The room sensed it. The audience leaned in. The silence grew heavier, almost anticipatory. For Jasmine Crockett, that single misstep wasn't just an opening. It was destiny tapping her on the shoulder. Every ounce of her preparation, every sleepless night, every memory of struggle and sacrifice aligned in that moment. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but history had just cracked open. Because what happens when arrogance meets dignity? What happens when corruption underestimates truth? The answer was about to shake the very foundations of that courtroom and ripple far beyond its walls. But before the applause, before the recognition, before the shockwaves that would sweep across America, there was a backstory. And to understand why this takedown was so inevitable, so devastating, we must first confront the arrogance that stood across from her.
Long before the cameras rolled and the applause echoed, there was a figure whose shadow loomed over the case, a man who mistook power for wisdom and arrogance for authority. To understand the drama of that fateful day, you must first know the antagonist who strutted into the courtroom certain of victory, certain that his pedigree, his connections, his air of superiority would carry him through. He was a man born into the velvet cushion of privilege, groomed not in the fires of struggle, but in the echo chambers of entitlement. His record was decorated with headlines that painted him as a relentless fighter for order, though in truth, order was a mask for control. He wore his degrees, his titles, and his access to wealth like armor, never considering that true strength comes not from privilege, but from resilience. This was someone who had built a career on silencing opponents with sneers rather than substance, on exploiting technicalities rather than pursuing justice. His arrogance was not new, it was habitual. In prior hearings, he had reduced opposing counsel to flustered silence, relying on theatrical interruptions and rhetorical bullying. He confused volume with persuasion, mistaking intimidation for intellect. Each time he left a courtroom with smirks and backslaps from allies, his ego swelled larger, feeding a dangerous illusion that he was untouchable. But arrogance carries its own cracks. His history was littered with blunders, glossed over by power. Statements made in moments of carelessness revealed elitist disdain for ordinary people. He mocked those who lacked his connections, dismissing the struggles of working families as personal failures. In one notorious exchange, he bragged that the system works if you know how to work it, unaware or uncaring that millions were trapped in systems rigged against them. Hypocrisy clung to him like a second skin. He championed accountability when it served his narrative, but dodged it when it threatened his own circle. He spoke of respect for law, yet bent rules whenever bending favored his ambitions.
To him, justice was not blind, it was negotiable, a commodity reserved for the highest bidder or the loudest voice. And so, when Jasmine Crockett's name appeared opposite his on the docket, he barely blinked. To him, she was an afterthought, another idealist who would crumble under pressure. He underestimated her from the start. He saw her not as a peer, not as a force, but as someone to be brushed aside. And in that miscalculation lay the seeds of his undoing. Because while he mistook her calm for weakness, she was watching. While he strutted, she prepared. While he clung to his history of bluster, she built her arsenal of truth. This wasn't the first time arrogance had underestimated resilience. History is full of such collisions, when pride assumes the fight is over before it begins, and dignity rises to deliver a blow that cannot be forgotten. But in this courtroom, the stakes were magnified by the times. America was watching, fractured and weary. Every contradiction in his record, every elitist smirk, every hypocritical dodge had created a reservoir of resentment that was waiting, aching for someone to crack it open. And Jasmine Crockett was not just an attorney that day. She was the vessel for that moment, the hand of history ready to flip arrogance on its head. As he walked into the courtroom, confident smirk in place, allies at his side, he didn't notice the shift in the air. He didn't see the way people sat straighter when she entered, the way her very presence seemed to calm nerves and sharpen focus. He believed he had already won. He believed decorum would shield him, that tradition would favor him, that his swagger was unassailable. But arrogance is a blindfold, and blindfolds are dangerous in battle. Because when this arrogance walked into the courtroom, it was about to meet its match.
Before the thunder of applause, before the headlines blared her name, there was a woman who had walked a road few could imagine. Jasmine Crockett did not step into the courtroom wrapped in privilege or arrogance. She carried scars, stories, and the quiet strength shaped by struggle. Her beginnings were not gilded. They were humble, rooted in communities where dignity was currency and resilience was survival. Born into a world where opportunity was never guaranteed, Jasmine learned early that silence could suffocate and injustice could shape lives as surely as law. She was the daughter of a people who had been told, "Wait your turn," of neighbors who worked twice as hard for half the recognition. She saw firsthand the cracks in America's promise, cracks where the poor slipped, where the immigrant stumbled, where the unheard cried out with no microphone to amplify their pain. These weren't abstractions to her, they were lived reality. When she chose the law, it wasn't a career, it was a calling. While others chased prestige, Jasmine pursued service. She fought her way through law school, not with family wealth cushioning her steps, but with grit, sacrifice, and late nights where the library became both sanctuary and battleground. She worked jobs to pay tuition, studied under flickering lamps, and pushed forward even when the path felt impossible. She wasn't supposed to be here in the halls of power, and that's exactly why she fought so hard to claim her place. Her early years as an attorney weren't glamorous. They were spent in small offices and cramped courtrooms, representing people the system too often forgot. She defended tenants facing eviction, workers cheated of wages, families who had lost loved ones to unjust systems. She didn't measure victories in billable hours. She measured them in lives changed, in small breaths of dignity restored. Her clients saw not just a lawyer, but a fighter who carried their burdens as if they were their own. Service wasn't a slogan for Jasmine, it was her compass. Every case, every argument was guided by the belief that law should not just protect the powerful, but should elevate the vulnerable. She knew the weight of community, the sacred responsibility of carrying not just her own dreams, but the hopes of those who placed their trust in her. She stood on the shoulders of sacrifice, and she never forgot it. What set her apart wasn't only her intellect, it was her empathy. In a profession too often sterilized by procedure and detached language, Jasmine infused humanity into every motion, every statement. She reminded judges that behind every file was a beating heart. She reminded juries that fairness was not abstract, it was personal. And she reminded opponents that the law, when wielded with integrity, was sharper than any sneer or smirk. As her reputation grew, so did the respect of those who watched her work. Colleagues marveled at her composure, opponents learned to dread her precision, and communities began to see her more than an attorney. She was a voice that refused to be silenced, a voice that gave courage to those who had none. And yet she remained grounded. Despite every win, every recognition, Jasmine returned to her roots, to the neighborhoods and people who had shaped her. She never forgot that her strength came not from distance, but from closeness, from the connection to stories untold, to lives overlooked. So when she entered the federal courtroom that day, she didn't come alone. She carried with her every tenant wrongfully evicted, every worker cheated of wages, every family who had sat across from her desperate for justice. She carried more than legal briefs into the courtroom. She carried the weight of those unheard. And that weight did not slow her down. It anchored her, steadied her, gave her power that arrogance could never replicate. Her adversary thought the fight would be about sharp words and clever interruptions, but Jasmine had sharpened something far more lethal: resilience. Her every sentence was forged in the fire of her journey. Her calmness came not from arrogance, but from the knowledge that she had faced harder battles than this. And her clarity came from knowing she didn't stand for herself alone. She stood for everyone who had been dismissed, diminished, or denied. In her story, dignity was not a weakness, it was armor. Service was not a slogan, it was a weapon. And truth was not fragile, it was unbreakable. The courtroom could not yet see it, but every detail of Jasmine Crockett's past had led her here, to this moment, to this clash. Arrogance would come armed with swagger, but she would meet it with something far stronger: conviction. And conviction, once unleashed, can topple empires of entitlement.
The air inside the courtroom thickened as the arguments began to unfold. At first, it was procedural, the kind of measured back and forth that lulls observers into thinking this was just another hearing. But then, the antagonist made his move. He interrupted, not once, not twice, but with a rhythm designed to dominate. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, louder than necessary, slicing through Crockett's sentences before they could take shape. Each interruption wasn't about substance, it was about spectacle, an attempt to remind everyone in the room who, in his mind, held the authority. He grandstanded, turning his words not toward the judge, but toward the gallery, as if the courtroom were his stage and he the star performer. He mocked her phrasing, exaggerated her pauses, rolled his eyes in plain view of the jury. With every gesture, his arrogance seeped into the walls. He wasn't debating, he was belittling. He wasn't arguing law, he was performing superiority. And yet what he failed to see was how hollow the performance sounded to ears that had grown tired of theatrics. Jasmine Crockett did not bite. She did not match his volume, nor did she mirror his antics. Instead, she let the interruptions hang in the air, their ugliness naked and undeniable. She continued with measured clarity, each word a stone carefully laid in the foundation of an argument far sturdier than his noise. Where he was frantic, she was patient. Where he was reckless, she was deliberate. Her silence at his interruptions spoke louder than any rebuttal, a kind of poised defiance that slowly drew murmurs from the benches behind her. The gallery began to notice the contrast. Rising voices from the antagonist clashed with her steady cadence, and the difference was jarring. Glares flickered across the room. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the stenographer, trained to neutrality, pressed her lips tight, as if the weight of arrogance was pressing too hard on the sanctity of the proceedings. Each mockery dug his hole deeper. Each sarcastic barb exposed his insecurity. And Jasmine, calm as ever, gave him the rope he seemed so eager to tighten around his own credibility. She didn't need to humiliate him. He was doing that himself. All she needed was patience. The villain mistook her composure for weakness, failing to realize that composure is the most dangerous form of strength. He threw accusations meant to rattle her, to provoke an outburst. She didn't flinch. He tried to paint her as inexperienced, yet every word she spoke revealed mastery. He gestured wildly, but her stillness commanded more respect than his theatrics ever could. The tension rose like a storm gathering. Voices collided, murmurs swelled, glares sharpened. It was a battle of two energies, arrogance pushing harder, louder, uglier, and dignity standing firm, steady, unyielding. By the midpoint of the hearing, the contrast had crystallized so clearly that even the undecided in the room could feel the tilt. One side was unraveling, the other was ascending. But arrogance is stubborn. He doubled down, mocking not only her arguments, but even the idea that she could stand on equal ground. His laughter rang hollow, a brittle sound that betrayed desperation more than dominance. He believed the performance would break her. He believed the audience would side with volume over substance. He believed wrong. The murmurs grew louder now, not against her, but against him. The glares once scattered now converged, aimed squarely at the man unraveling before them. In his attempt to bury her beneath interruptions and mockery, he had unearthed something else entirely. The audience's sympathy for her, their impatience for him, their hunger for someone to put arrogance in its place. The room thought she might fold under the barrage, that she might finally crack under the weight of his performance. But then she rose. She rose slowly, not with the rushed defensiveness of someone trying to claw back control, but with the unhurried gravity of a woman who knew her time had come. The villain had exhausted his arsenal of interruptions and mockery. The room was heavy with the residue of arrogance. Jasmine Crockett stood, a stillness surrounding her, and let the silence stretch. Seconds ticked by. The gavel didn't fall. No one dared speak. In that pause, she reclaimed the entire room. Then she began. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear, resonant, unshaken. "Your Honor," she started, measured and deliberate, "what my colleague fails to grasp is not simply a matter of procedure, but of principle." She let that sentence hang, eyes sweeping across the courtroom, ensuring her words found purchase in every corner. The opposition shifted in his chair, his smirk tightening, as though he sensed the ground beneath him had begun to crack. Point by point, she dismantled his argument. Where he had barked over her words, she answered with precision. She cited precedent, cases whose names rolled from her tongue like iron, their weight undeniable. Each legal citation was a nail hammered into the coffin of his claim. She spoke of the Constitution, of equal protection, of accountability, not as abstract doctrines, but as living promises America owed to its people. And then the pivot, the moment she bridged law with life. She paused, just long enough for the courtroom to lean in. This isn't about technicalities. This is about people, real people, families who have waited too long for justice, workers who wonder if the law protects only the powerful, citizens who still believe fairness belongs to them too. A murmur rippled through the gallery. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the stakes. She took the sterile language of the opposition and infused it with flesh and blood, with dignity and humanity. The villain attempted to interrupt again, but Judge Tapar's hand rose, firm and commanding. "Let her finish," he said. The rare defense of decorum carried weight, and for the first time the arrogance sat silent. Jasmine pressed forward. She recounted not only the flaws in her reasoning, but also the hypocrisy of pretending to defend justice while dismissing the very people justice is meant to serve. She reminded the court that accountability is not negotiable, that law without humanity is not law at all, it is theater. Each phrase struck like a drumbeat, steady, unrelenting. She paused again, letting her opponent squirm under the gaze of the judge, the jury, the spectators. Then she delivered the line that shifted the air entirely. "What my colleague calls confidence, the community calls arrogance. And what he calls finality, this courtroom must now recognize as failure." The words hit with surgical precision. Gasps scattered across the benches. The villain's face flushed, his jaw tightening as if he had swallowed poison. Jasmine remained calm, steady as a mountain. She had not raised her voice, but she had raised the entire standard of the room. Judge Tapar leaned forward, his expression unmistakably impressed. His pen stopped moving, his eyes fixed squarely on her. Those who knew him understood he was not prone to visible reactions, and yet here he was, compelled to acknowledge brilliance as it unfolded before him. She pressed on, weaving law and humanity into a tapestry impossible to ignore. She spoke of America's promise, of the duty of courts to reflect not only the letter of law, but the spirit of justice. Her sentences built like waves, first gentle, then powerful, then crashing with unstoppable force. By the time she reached her closing, the villain was no longer her opponent. He was her cautionary tale. Her final words rang out like a verdict. "The question before us is simple. Will this court allow arrogance to overshadow accountability, or will it affirm that justice still belongs to the people? I believe the answer is clear." The silence that followed was electric. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. And then it began, the sound that no federal courtroom is designed for. Applause. Fierce, uncontainable applause. It rolled like thunder through the chamber, hands slamming together in defiance of decorum, in celebration of dignity. The gallery erupted, unable to restrain itself. Even the reporters, trained to neutrality, clapped in awe before remembering their pens. Judge Tapar raised his hand, not to silence, but to speak. His words, steady and deliberate, cut through the roar. "What we have just witnessed is an argument of rare brilliance. Counsel Crockett, your clarity and dedication to justice honor this court." It was more than praise. It was vindication. A federal judge had publicly recognized what everyone else already knew. She had not just won the argument, she had won the moment. The villain sat slumped, his swagger evaporated. No mockery could erase what had just transpired. No interruption could rewrite the history unfolding before him. He was not the dominant force in that room anymore. He was the man who had been dismantled, piece by piece, by the calm persistence of truth. The applause swelled again, louder this time, echoing through the high ceilings, reverberating in the hearts of everyone present. Some wiped away tears, others shouted her name. And as Jasmine Crockett stood there, steady as ever, she embodied more than a lawyer defending a case. She embodied a movement, a reminder, a living answer to the question of whether dignity could triumph over arrogance. By the time she finished, the courtroom was no longer just watching a lawyer. They were witnessing history. But history does not end at the courthouse doors, because while the walls shook with applause inside, the reaction outside these walls was even louder.
The echoes of applause inside that courtroom did not fade when the doors closed. They spilled into the streets, into newsrooms, into the digital bloodstream of America. Within minutes, phones lit up with notifications, live streams replayed the moment on loop, and social media erupted with a single unifying cry, #CrockettWins. The hashtag trended within the hour, climbing past celebrity gossip and breaking news. Clips of Jasmine's mic-drop counterattack spread like wildfire. Some edits slowed the moment when Judge Thapar leaned forward in admiration, replaying it with cinematic music swelling beneath. Others zoomed in on the instant her words cut through arrogance like a blade, followed by captions declaring, "Dignity is undefeated." Memes poured in. One showed the antagonist sitting red-faced, paired with the caption, "When arrogance meets facts." Another froze Jasmine mid-sentence with glowing text above her head, "Queen of the Court." TikTok users spliced her calm takedown with popular beats, turning a federal hearing into viral anthem material. For a generation hungry for victories against corruption and entitlement, this was fuel, and they consumed it ravenously. Commentators scrambled to respond. Cable news panels replayed the footage in slow motion, dissecting every pause, every reaction. Some anchors marveled at her legal precision. Others highlighted her composure under relentless interruption. Even critics, who rarely praised progressive figures, found themselves acknowledging the force of the performance. "You can't teach that kind of poise," one conservative pundit admitted through gritted teeth. The opposition, meanwhile, reeled. Their star figure, once so untouchable, had been reduced to a punchline. Op-eds surfaced questioning his credibility, his arrogance now scrutinized instead of celebrated. Allies who once cheered his grandstanding kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with a collapse so public, so undeniable. In the political world, where perception is power, his downfall was more than humiliation. It was erosion. And yet the ripple effects weren't limited to elites and commentators. Across the country, ordinary people felt the resonance. In small towns and city neighborhoods, community leaders shared clips of Jasmine's words as if they were scripture. Teachers played the moment in classrooms, telling students, "This is what courage looks like." Families gathered around TVs, nodding with a pride they hadn't felt in years. For many, this wasn't just about a case. It was about seeing themselves, immigrants, workers, women, people of color, reflected in a victory that defied arrogance. Celebrities joined the chorus. Athletes tweeted support. Musicians posted clips with captions like, "Bars, but make it legal." A-list actors shared their admiration, some even hinting at future projects to dramatize the scene on screen. Each endorsement amplified the moment, turning what began as a courtroom drama into a cultural phenomenon. And then came the op-eds, the think pieces, the Sunday columns. Writers framed the event as a turning point, a reminder that America's institutions could still produce moments of integrity. It wasn't just an argument. It was a reclamation of dignity in an age that too often mistakes bluster for brilliance. Even late-night hosts joined in. Comedy monologues replayed the villain's mocking interruptions before cutting to Jasmine's knockout response, the audience in their studios roaring as much as the courtroom audience had. The laughter was cathartic, the applause contagious. But beneath the humor and memes, something deeper was taking root. The people who had long felt excluded from the promise of justice began to feel seen.
Hashtags gave way to personal stories, individuals sharing their own experiences of being dismissed or silenced, ending their posts with, "But dignity will always win." The courtroom moment had become a vessel, carrying their voices further than they ever thought possible. The applause didn't stop in that courtroom. It echoed across America. It thundered in trending hashtags, in viral edits, in dinner table conversations, in whispered hopes that maybe, just maybe, the tide was shifting. And while Jasmine Crockett herself remained composed, continuing her work without indulging in spectacle, the country knew what it had witnessed. This wasn't a flash in the pan, nor was it a coincidence. It was the collision of arrogance with resilience, of entitlement with truth. But if the nation celebrated her victory, it also hungered for the lesson behind it. What was it that turned composure into a weapon, dignity into a force that even a federal judge could not ignore? The answer wasn't just in her arguments. It was in the moral clarity that framed them. And that clarity was about to be distilled into a lesson no one would forget.
In the quiet that followed the courtroom storm, the lesson of the day became unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett did not need to yell, to dramatize, or to humiliate. Her composure alone reframed the arrogance that had filled the room, transforming it into a mirror that reflected its own inadequacy. Where the villain had sought to dominate, she demonstrated that true power lies in patience, in clarity, and in unwavering commitment to principle. Judge Tapar's rare public praise was more than a commendation. It was institutional recognition that dignity, intellect, and moral courage are not just ideals, but forces that shape justice. In that acknowledgement, the courtroom witnessed something profound, a system capable of honoring not the loudest, but the right. It was a reaffirmation that law, when wielded with integrity, can elevate rather than oppress, can inspire rather than intimidate. And the symbolism extended beyond that room. For every citizen who had watched, for every immigrant or worker who had felt overlooked, Crockett's composure was a beacon. She proved that a commitment to truth does not bend under pressure, that standing firm is not obstinacy, but courage, and that dignity, when sustained, can dismantle arrogance more thoroughly than any confrontation driven by anger or spectacle. Her victory was not merely legal, it was moral, cultural, and deeply human. She had turned an encounter designed to intimidate into an affirmation of values that resonate across generations: justice, fairness, and equality. Every pause she took, every word chosen with precision, every calm gaze that met the villain's faltering confidence became a lesson etched into memory. When arrogance meets dignity, dignity wins, every time. The broader moral was unmistakable. Justice is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is a promise owed to the people. Americanness, in its truest sense, is measured not by wealth or status, but by the courage to uphold ideals that protect everyone, especially the marginalized. And unity is born not from uniformity, but from collective recognition that integrity and humanity must guide our actions, our laws, and our society. In reflecting on the day's events, it becomes clear that the courtroom was a microcosm of a larger battle, a battle between entitlement and principle, between performative authority and authentic leadership, between fear and courage. Crockett's triumph was not simply a personal victory, it was an emblem for every citizen who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. It reminded them that their voices matter, that their struggles are not invisible, and that standing with truth can bend even the most entrenched power structures. As applause still echoed in memory, as headlines replayed her mastery, and as social media celebrated her brilliance, the lesson remained constant. The world rewards those who do not compromise their integrity, who meet arrogance with composure, and who uphold the dignity of others as their guiding principle. In the face of intimidation, there is strength in steadiness. In the face of mockery, there is power in persistence. And in the face of arrogance, there is triumph in righteousness. The courtroom had seen it firsthand, the nation had witnessed it unfold, and history had recorded it. This was more than a legal argument. It was a demonstration of values that matter, a narrative that inspires, a truth that endures. And as the day faded and the applause became a memory, one fact remained unshakable. When arrogance meets dignity, dignity does not merely endure, it prevails. And in doing so, it uplifts us all. The story of that courtroom, of that moment, of that hero, was far from over. Its echoes would shape conversations, inspire actions, and remind a nation that justice, unity, and courage are not abstract ideals, they are achievable realities. And beyond the courtroom doors, the world waited to see how this lesson would ripple into the lives of those watching, eager to witness the full measure of its impact.
And so it came full circle. Judge Amul Tapar, a figure known for his measured reserve, had risen to publicly venerate Jasmine Crockett's brilliance. The moment was electric, unforgettable, and captured in the hearts of every witness, every viewer, and every citizen who had been watching. The applause, the admiration, the recognition, it was more than personal. It was symbolic. It confirmed what so many had felt. Integrity, clarity, and courage command respect, even in the halls of power. This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a cultural victory. It sent a clear message. Arrogance and entitlement may dominate the moment, but dignity, perseverance, and truth endure. It reminded us that when someone stands unwavering, representing the voiceless, and holding fast to justice, the world takes notice. It reminded us that America's promise is alive, not in theory, but in action, in moments where ordinary courage intersects with extraordinary skill. And now, this moment belongs to everyone who believes that integrity matters. To everyone who has been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. To everyone who dreams of a world where fairness and respect are not privileges, but rights. If you believe dignity deserves applause, share this story. Spread the word so others can witness the power of composure and courage. Subscribe to follow the journey of voices like Jasmine Crockett, who turn principles into action and keep the movement alive. Because every time we celebrate moments like this, we remind the world, truth can triumph, integrity can inspire, and dignity will always stand taller than arrogance. And in that standing, we all rise.